In the 1950s, Pontiac was facing a crisis. It had to change or vanish. Its cars were dull, and something new was needed now. They decided to make good-looking, affordable cars that went fast. This simple idea saved Pontiac and spurred the development of one of the great automotive icons, the GTO. A new GTO hit the streets in 2004, 30 years after the original faded away. The reintroduction of America's first muscle car gave fans something to celebrate at the 2004 GTO National Convention. To welcome the new GTO, the organizers set this year's event in the center of GTO country, Pontiac, Michigan. Pontiac was the spawning ground of the first GTO. Over 1,000 people made the journey to share stories, look at one another's cars, and soak up the legend of the GTO. They discovered it had its roots in post-war America. The American economy took off after World War II. Pent-up demand, abundant jobs, and the money people had saved during the war triggered enormous sales for car makers. Under the guise of national defense, President Eisenhower pushed through the creation of an interstate highway system. These new roads fueled the growth of suburbs and transformed Americans into commuters. Suburbanites loved their cars and started spending more and more time on the road. The car makers had finally retooled after the war and were now turning out an endless array of new cars. The competition got tougher and tougher. Jim Wengers, an account executive for Pontiac's advertising agency, had an insider's view.
The car shortage had kind of been diminished after World War II. You know, during that immediate post-war era, everybody would drive whatever they could get their hands on. But by now, the market had been fulfilled, and people became more selective.
Wengers found out that Pontiac was in trouble. Its cars were boring, reliable, but dull.
Reality was that the car was a nice car. And by now, this was in the mid-50s, you couldn't sell a nice car.
General Motors' other divisions, Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac, were zooming ahead. But Pontiac was stuck. Its future was at stake.
It was actually the mid-50s that ultimately led General Motors to the conclusion that this division needed to have a major change, not only in its product development, but in the way in which the car was imaged and the car was marketed.
GM executives began to think about killing off Pontiac. But GM's president, Harlow Curtis, wanted to rescue it. He knew just the right person for the job, the son of a former GM president, Bunky Knudsen. When Bunky took over Pontiac in July of 1956, he was sure he could transform it. He just wasn't sure how.
Oldsmobile had a pretty good name for luxury and nice, comfortable size, and Chevrolet, which had a pretty good name for good, quality, entry-level, low-priced merchandise were squeezing Pontiac from both top and bottom. And Pontiac had nothing to offer except just another nice car.
Knutson did a little polling. He asked his kids what they thought of Pontiacs. They politely told him. He had a lot of work to do. His son was only 15, but Knutson knew that Pontiac had to appeal to the kids his age. They were part of the baby boomers who'd change everything. Ignore them at your peril.
That was the stroke of genius. That was the one thing that Pontiac saw, the management team at Pontiac, and I like to think that I was kind of part of a contribution factor. We saw what was going to become the greatest market segment ever to hit this country, which was the group we now call the baby boomers.
Knutson felt the boomers would respond to good-looking, affordable cars that had real performance. Fortunately, Pontiac had a strong V8. One way to get attention was to win some races. Nobody believed these stodgy cars could win, but Knutson was determined to try.
Well, they made up their mind that Grandma, which is what they kind of laughingly called it, you know, the nice car, you know, that was built to last 100,000 miles, conservatively styled, conservatively powered. They decided that they were going to turn Grandma into a teenager.
Knutson launched an assault on Florida's Daytona Speed Week and Race in February of 1957. He hoped this would serve notice that Pontiac was changing.
Bunky was a car guy. He understood performance, he understood young people, he understood performance cars, he understood that racing at that point was a very important thing to help build images.
Knutson's team churned up the sand and started to break records. One car clocked in at 141.2 miles per hour, the fastest time ever for an American car in its class. The speed tests and qualifying heats on the beach were just a warm-up for the main event, the Daytona 500. At the time, this ragged contest was run on an oval course, carved out of the beach and the scrub brush. Knutson's cars were pitted against experienced teams from Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet. No one believed Pontiac had a chance. But lap after lap, they showed they could compete. They kept fighting, and by the finish, Cotton Owens, a Pontiac driver, flew across the finish line and captured a win. The gods had smiled on Pontiac. Knutson and Pontiac were on their way. To keep building Pontiac's image, he assembled a team that shared his passion for performance. He poached Pete Estes from Oldsmobile and snapped up a young engineer from the remains of Packard, John DeLorean. DeLorean was a little wild, but he was the best engineer Knutson had ever met, and he knew what young people wanted. This dream team started building cars to ride the coming wave of baby boomers.
Well, in the late 50s, most of those baby boomers were kids. They were 10, 11, maybe 12 years old. And they were just now coming into their own as an entity. And Pontiac was the first one to kind of recognize this because Mr. Knutson, himself understood it as a manager and as a marketer.
Their first effort hit the streets in 1959. The new, long, low, and wide look became known as the wide track.
One of the most significant things about it is you could look at that car and immediately see that it had that wider tread. It was almost kind of a selling message of its own. You looked at the car and say, oh yeah, there's one of those wide-track Pontiacs.
The new look and racing success gave Pontiac the boost it needed. It jumped from 6th to 4th place in sales. Knudsen was rewarded with the top job at Chevrolet, but his team stayed to finish the work at Pontiac. By 1962, they knocked Rambler out of 3rd place and were in line just behind Chevrolet and Ford. They were going strong. Then the corporation dropped a bombshell, a ban on racing. It was an era when racing deaths were increasingly common. The big three auto companies didn't want the bad publicity associated with sponsoring something dangerous. They also feared that the public would pressure the government to add costly safety features to their passenger cars. The easy route: quit racing. This was a death sentence to Pontiac. But DeLorean had an idea. He liked the power of Pontiac's large 389 cubic inch engines and thought these big power plants would be great in a smaller car.
In other words, take the biggest engine and stuff it into the smallest chassis, which is a trick the hot rod community had been doing for years. Well, Pontiac decided to do it as a manufacturer.
It was more than GM's anti-racing rules allowed, but he snuck it past them and had a hot new car to launch in 1964. He called it the GTO. It was a stealthy introduction, no fanfare, but the dealers knew what DeLorean was doing, and they quickly ordered 5,000 GTOs. The muscle car era had begun.
The car was at the right place at the right time, the GTO. And of course, when it hit the marketplace, it was an overnight smash.
People liked the lack of chrome, its aggressive stance, and most of all, its blistering performance. It had a list of options that allowed a buyer to veer towards speed or more luxury cruising. DeLorean wanted something that was part BMW and part hot rod. Young American drivers weren't looking for a European road car. They wanted something that was fast and good-looking, the perfect cruising machine.
And the Pontiac GTO was the absolute teenager's dream because it was a $2,500 car that could sit there and kind of thumb its nose at just about anybody out there. You know, cars costing twice as much.
By 1965, it was a major success. Sales had jumped from 30,000 in 1964 to 75,000 by the end of the year. DeLorean rode the GTO to the top. He was named Pontiac's general manager. Pontiac soared with the GTO's success. It touched the nerve of the growing cruising scene. GTOs started to dominate Detroit's Woodward Avenue, the epicenter of the area's growing performance car culture. But the GTO didn't have the turf to itself. Chrysler, Ford, and Chevrolet introduced cars to compete. While challenged, DeLorean's GTO still ruled Woodward Avenue and its meeting grounds, the drive-ins.
This was a very, very famous drive-in site. The name of the drive-in was the Totem Pole. And it used to be a real serious hangout for most of the young folks who were out cruising, looking for girls as well as a race. which they could almost always find.
It was really quite a thing with the drive-ins. Everybody pulled into the drive-in. You'd line up to get in to get a spot, and you would chip in the money. Coke was 15 cents. Hot dogs were 50 cents. Hamburgers were 45 cents. And you would usually share one because you didn't have enough money because you had to buy gasoline. It was 18.9 during the gas wars.
Almost every night, over 2,000 street racers would come out. These baby boomers loved their hot cars and wanted to see what they could do. 4 on the floor, 3 deuces, and a 389 meant Pontiacs and cruisin' Woodward. Detroit's Woodward Avenue was, and still is, perfectly suited for cruising. But fueled by a heady mix of burgers, fries, and cokes, blended with raging hormones and stirred by performance cars, young people engaged in a high-test mating ritual on streets all over the country.
Well, we would wait there for a certain person to come through. We wanted to go race, and then we would follow them out and go line up on the next traffic light, as many as 4 abreast, and have at it. It was the car culture, the competition, bragging rights was so important of who beat who, because it lasted forever.
DeLorean's engineers, designers, and executives also got into the act. They'd leave work and head down to Woodward to see how their cars fared against the regulars.
We had very famous names coming out here. John DeLorean, George DeLorean, very famous names that all started out here on Woodward Avenue.
To keep the GTO on top, Pontiac's engineers used what they learned on Woodward to develop performance enhancements that dealers could sell. GTO's racing was not confined to the streets. Even though Pontiac couldn't officially sponsor racing, they helped drivers take their cars to drag strips. The cars performed and helped to spread the word that the GTO was hot. Fans have preserved many of these winning Pontiacs and still take them out to show just how amazing they were. In 1969, DeLorean was given the top job at GM's largest division, Chevrolet. His replacement, Jim McDonald, didn't have the same passion for performance or feel for what young people wanted. The GTO was still a winner, but times were changing. The new GTO judge, inspired by a comedy bit from a popular television variety show, was feeling the competition. Pontiac's lineup started to lose its grip on the marketplace. Plymouth muscled in on their third-place roost. It was clear that the 70s were going to be a tough race. The 1970s were a challenging decade for America's performance cars. Government-mandated reductions in leaded fuels made automakers lower engine compression ratios. Power dropped. Other emission controls sapped more power, and then fuel economy standards, prompted by gas shortages, took the muscle out of the muscle cars. Then the police started to target the cruisers on Woodward. It was a hard time.
They eventually put signs up that said, no cruising through drive-ins. And if you went through and didn't buy an item like a Coca-Cola, you'd get a ticket. And so that was the beginning of the end of the drive-ins.
By 1974, the GTO also was history. Gone, but not forgotten. Fans kept them, restored them, took them out for cruises, and even passed them down. These were cars that memories were made of.
I originally purchased a GTO in 1965. I met my wife when I had one of these, and just kind of reflect on all the things that I did back in those days. And I found this up in Sacramento and just started from there, started rebuilding it, and the thrill is never gone.
No one thought the GTO would return, but GM's Australian subsidiary, Holden, was building a high-performance car that caught Detroit's eye. After some modifications, this car was brought to the States and launched as the new GTO. GTO loyalists were somewhat miffed because they thought their ideas about the new GTO were ignored by GM. Many didn't like the car's looks. The 40th anniversary was the first time that most would get a chance to actually see one in person and see how it performed. Pontiac tapped a noted rally driver, Reese Millen, to take the unconvinced for a test drive. He showed how the GTO handled the new sport of drifting.
Usually when people hop out of the car, they really don't have much to say but scream and holler. You know, it's another thing to watch it from the outside, but as you got to experience to sit in the passenger seat, you know, you see the cones coming or the barriers out there, and it looks like you're going to slide right into them. But your judgment of distance and speed is so precise that you can run right up and touch a cone or touch a barrier and still be in control. So it's dynamic, it works, and it's exciting sitting in here or watching it.
While it wasn't a classic cruiser, the riders couldn't deny its power and agility.
I'm impressed. They're going to sell a ton of them, probably. They'll sell a ton of them. Big fun. But it's fun, right? Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Got another ride of my life. Get back in line.
Even drag racing legend Arnie Bestwick, who'd won the first NHRA championship in 1953 and later survived a near-fatal racing fire, couldn't believe how the car performed.
So what kind of car you got out here?
67 GTO.
It's a fun car. And I could forget the styling. I might not like all that well because of the performance of the car. It's just breathtaking. It's breathtaking.
But I'll tell you what, when you get that thing up like over 40...
Kip Wasenko, director of GM's Performance Division's styling department, assembled a team to create a new vision for the GTO in time for the 2004 Woodward Dream Cruise.
We have listened to what people have said, so we've digested and taken those words to heart. I think we've addressed the car to give it more muscle, much more presence, but it's still true to what a GTO is.
Wasenko's team members had deep feelings about the GTO. They wanted to make sure they got it right this time.
When I was 17 years old, my mother went out and bought a brand new 1965 GTO. And that was a car that people took notice of. Well, the GTO today, they don't take notice of. This one, they'll take notice of. This has got the stance. It's a little more futuristic. It's got the heritage to it. That's what I like about it.
The classic GTOs have been making us feel good for years, and it looks like a GTO will once again provide a new generation with the excitement of high-performance thrills. The glory days of the muscle car era can't be recreated, but they'll never be forgotten. first GTO. Over 1,000 people made the journey to share stories, look at one another's cars and soak up the legend of the GTO. They discovered it had its roots in post-war America. The American economy took off after World War II. Pent-up demand, a new GTO hit the streets in 2004. In the 1950s, Pontiac was facing a crisis. It had to change or vanish. Its cars were dull, and something new was needed now. They decided, make good-looking, affordable cars that went fast. This simple idea saved Pontiac and spurred the development of one of the great automotive icons, the GTO. Abundant jobs and the money people had saved during the war triggered enormous sales for car makers. Under the guise of national defense, President Eisenhower pushed through the creation of an interstate highway system. These new roads fueled the growth of suburbs and transformed Americans into commuters. Suburbanites loved their cars and started spending more and more time on the road. 30 years after the original faded away, the reintroduction of America's first muscle car gave fans something to celebrate at the 2004 GTO National Convention. To welcome the new GTO, the organizers set this year's event in the center of GTO country, Pontiac, Michigan. Pontiac was the spawning ground of the